tough to follow, and Michael was tough to follow. And if people know me, they know I don't actually like to use notes, but when I only have 12 minutes to speak, I do need to have notes. Some of you probably recognize my name. You might recognize my face. I tend to make the news. When you have a story like this, even though the media doesn't like to talk about people like me, every once in a while we squeak our stories out. And, I had this great blessing just a couple of weeks ago to meet with a 10-year-old abortion survivor from Eastern Europe. And my team had been working with her family for many months to prepare them. She had a lot of questions, and they knew that it was time to share her story with her. And I know we think, oh my gosh, 10. I can remember what it's like to be 10. I don't know how I feel about telling somebody at 10. But I can tell you this family was prepared to share her story. And after they told her, she had every emotion that you probably would too. And she asked to meet with me. And in the midst of lots of questions that she had for me, there were two that stood out to me that I want to share with you as I start to share about abortion survivors tonight. Her first question was, Melissa, will my biological mom ever come looking for me and try to do this again? I can tell you that whether you're 10 years old or you're 44 like me, I'm 44, it's okay. All right, you heard I have a couple of kids. I can tell you that that part of what happens to abortion survivors is always something that we experience. That deep-founded fear that maybe our lives are always in danger. I have spent a lot of my life healing, and now I bring that to abortion survivors around the world, but I can tell you, I know what that little girl feels like to know that maybe our lives are still in danger. But the other thing she asked me about is something that people don't always understand. She looked at me that day and she said, Melissa, will anybody besides my family love me if they ever know my story? She said, I want to be a mom someday. Pretty bright 10-year-old, right? She said, I want to be a mom someday. I want to get married. But will any man ever want to marry me if he knows what someone already did to me? And I had a lot to say to her that day as I choked back my tears. But you know what I told her? I said, honey, even though your story may seem scary to people, it's not you that is scary. What was done to you is something most people don't understand. Our world just doesn't know a lot about people like us. And that's why I'm here, is because I'm going to keep changing the world. So by the time you get old enough to feel like you want to share your story or get married, the world will be changed so much that people will know about abortion survivors. And that's what I'm here to share with you tonight. I have a lot that I could share with you, but my clock is ticking, and now I know I have 9 minutes. I pay attention, Georgette. This is what happens when you testify before Congress a lot. You tend to watch your time. That's a whole other story later. You can just say I've been cut off by some Democratic leaders many, many times. Time. So I watch my time. Many of you know my story, but for those of you who don't, I'll share a little bit about it with you, because then it all makes sense. Why I found this organization and why I know so much about abortion survivors. As I shared, I'm 44 years old, which when you do the math and you look at history, you know that I survived an abortion not long after Roe versus Wade was passed. So as we march this weekend, I know it has such a heaviness on all of us. This is a time we come together, and yes, we find joy in the relationships that we have with people around the world, just like Georgette and I find so much joy when we get to be together. But I also know that we mark our time together with grief over the fact that this is still happening in our country, that this has happened to nearly 63, 64 million children, that we can even put our finger on the pulse of that number. And of course, the grief comes from knowing that, yes, there are children like me who survive abortions and are not alive to share their story. As we march tomorrow, I march because every human being's life matters. I march because I live with the pain of what abortion has done to me, what it has done to my family. I march because it will end, and it will end in our time. I have hope about that. Roe versus Wade was my death sentence because 44 years ago, my biological mother, like so many women in her position, was forced to have an abortion. My birth mother was a college student. She wasn't married to my biological father yet. And it was someone in her family, her own mother, who forced her to have the saline infusion abortion that was meant to end my life. And trust me, my family has a lot of secrets and a lot of stories that I've helped to shed light on. But the reality is my grandmother was a prominent nurse in their community, worked hand in hand with a local abortionist. And that's how they were able to force that abortion upon my birth mother against her will. If you haven't yet heard a story like my birth mother's, you will many times. In a world that wants to talk about abortion being a choice and a right, we know that statistically, very few women really have any choice when it comes to abortion. That saline infusion abortion that they forced upon my birth mother was the most common one performed back in the 1970s. It actually involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald me to death. Usually it lasted about 3 days, but we know through my medical records that I soaked in that toxic salt solution for 5 days. 2 days longer than the standards of the procedure, while they tried time and time again to induce my birth mother's labor. The intent was for them to induce her labor and have me be expelled from the womb as a successful abortion, otherwise known as a deceased child. But that 5th day when they finally induced my birth mother's labor, that is the day that I was accidentally born alive. You have a birthday, right? I now celebrate my birthday on the day that I was accidentally born alive. The gravity of that is never lost on me. And I wish I could tell you that when I was born alive that day, all of the medical professionals saw my inherent dignity and value. But as Georgette mentioned, and we know, children like me are not always immediately provided medical care. Decades ago, a famous abortionist nicknamed abortion survivors like me the dreaded complication of abortion, a child who lives. That somehow our lives are something to be dreaded, avoided. And we know what that means, right? When you want to avoid a circumstance like mine. And I now know that when I was born alive that day, there were demands made to leave me in the hospital room to die. Through my medical records, we know that I was laid aside for a period of time before I was rushed off to the NICU that day, and ultimately medical care was started that sustained my life. My abortionist performed that abortion believing my birth mother was about 18 to 20 weeks pregnant with me. But the fact that I was able to live and I weighed almost 3 pounds made it clear that my birth mother was probably more like 31 weeks. 31 weeks. And we live in a society that wants to somehow say that circumstances like mine are rare, that people like me don't really exist. But my friend Jen is at the back table with me. Jen is on my team at the Abortion Survivors Network. Jen also happens to be an abortion survivor. We have now connected with over 415 abortion survivors. I know, just 2 this week, Georgette. 415 from 18 different countries. But statistically, most come from the United States. And again, decades ago, Dr. Willard Cates, who was the head of surveillance for the CDC and their abortion-related activities, Dr. Willard Cates identified that through the CDC, they were estimating 300 to 400 live births a year after failed abortions. I'll do the math for you already if you aren't scratching that out. 300 to 400 live births a year. If you take that over the course of just our years of legalized abortion, and trust me, we have survivors of illegal attempts of abortion in our network also. But if you do the math, you can scratch out easily 18 to 20,000 abortion survivors in the United States alone. So when we talk about 415, I celebrate finding all of those abortion survivors. But the reality is there are tens of thousands of people like Jen and I that exist in our world around you. And I hear of them in your schools. I hear of them in your churches. And lots of people have questions about how often this happens. How does this happen? Well, it's a miracle. That's how it happens. Abortionists also make a lot of mistakes. Abortionists typically don't perform adequate exams and don't know how far along women really are in their pregnancies. And so that's how children like me ultimately survive their abortion procedures, because they don't perform enough of an examination to know who they're really dealing with. Some survivors are alive because their biological mother stopped the abortion procedure in the midst of it because they were in incredible pain. And the types of procedures we survive are not always what you expect them to be. Congress has essentially told me to keep my mouth shut many, many times because the procedure that I survived isn't something that is performed routinely anymore. But I've let them know that any time a child's life is endangered by abortion, I'm relevant to the conversation. And so we see children survive abortion pill reversal. We see chemical abortions, those children surviving both pills. We see children surviving D&Cs. Actually, I was just contacted by a survivor today who survived a D&C abortion in 1975. We see vacuum aspiration survivors. We see dismemberment survivors. And I know that leads to more questions. We can answer those later, but what I can tell you is that it's a miracle when children can survive dismemberment. And if you haven't seen survivor Nick Hoot in the paper before, Nick is one of those very survivors who survived a dismemberment, and he is missing some of his limbs. We have survivors who survive illegal attempts to abort. It's not pleasant to hear about, but think about coat hangers and all the things the other side wants to say they don't want to go back to. Abortion survivors don't want to go back there either, because their lives were in danger then too. And so that is just a little bit of a primer about abortion survivors. And I know we have a little bit of time later tonight that you can ask me more questions, and trust me, you can ask me anything. I like to think I've been asked everything, but maybe we'll find out after tonight. But as we gather this weekend, I just want to encourage you to follow Michael's rallying cry for you. This isn't just something abortion survivors like me are called to do. People often say, oh, Melissa, you were given this great purpose. You're right, I was, and I'm forever grateful for my life and the calling that God has put on my life. But each and every one of us are called to be a part of this social justice movement, for lives to be saved, for women and men to be provided true resources and support, and for abortion to not only be illegal, but unthinkable. So as we gather tonight and we march tomorrow, I hope that this isn't just a one-time event for you. I hope that what happens here this weekend is something that you are marching out in your day-to-day life, because people you are going to encounter need you and what you know about the sanctity of life and the support that exists for people in your community. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you, Georgette, for inviting us.